Welcome to the podcast. It's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist. The Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and we have with us our head coach, Chad Timmerman.
Hey, everybody.
We have TrainerRoad and Cannondale's Amber Pierce.
Good morning, everyone.
And our CEO, Nate Pearson.
Hello.
Nate, you and I have changed our video for this week. You need to join us on YouTube to see it. Yours is fantastic, and it's a traveling setup.
I set this up like 10 minutes ago.
But the curtains behind you and the lamp, everything, it looks like it's like well planned. It's very good. Very good, Nate. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mine has like number plates and other things like that. And I'm disoriented with left and right now. Anyways, join us on YouTube, and you can do that every Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific. And if you're listening to this now, rate the podcast 5 stars, share it with your friends. Huge help for us. I wanted to mention one thing before we go any further, just something funny that I wanted to applaud specifically Ivy for. So somebody reached out on Twitter, and maybe Maxine can even share her screen on this one so we can see it. Somebody reached out on Twitter and said, hey, TrainerRoad, can you please make like a 15-minute workout for me and make it so that I can do it as an outside workout? Because I have a 15-minute commute. And it'd be great if you could do that exact thing for my specific needs. And then they posted the meme of like Dr. Evil asking Scotty to do that. So then Ivy made the workout, made it an outside workout, added the goals, and then she called the workout Scotty, which is just amazing.
It's just straight. It's a flat workout.
Just straight. Yep. So if you have 15-minute commutes, there you go. And that's how awesome Ivy and the rest of our team is. They listen to feedback, and when we can execute on it, we do it as quickly as we can. It's good stuff. So really good stuff.
Do we make custom workouts for everybody?
I might be setting a dangerous precedent.
Ivy, who knows?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
If
it's funny and tongue in cheek enough, she might just do it. Okay.
He is the best.
Yeah, truthfully. Absolutely. And by the way, congratulations to Ivy. She's now a Squid Bikes factory rider. She rides for the Squid Bikes company. Super exciting. I also wanted to recognize, last week we didn't talk about it, but Alex Wild had probably the best race of his career at Seattle. We talked about Keegan winning. He got third, and he was in the mix for the vast majority of the race too. And just like, as Alex has mentioned on the podcast before, he has such strong fitness, but he's struggled on execution in races. And it's really cool to see him put it together. So just wanted to give Alex a shout out. Everybody go and give him support and cheers, because he's going for Lifetime Grand Prix. Exciting stuff.
That's another point too, is that a lot of times execution, like you can be so fit and then you don't execute well in the race, and you can get down on yourself, like my training has to change, I'm not fit. Another one I was just thinking of, sometimes you can, especially in those longer races, you can train so much for long, but there'll be a 1-minute selection point that goes really hard, and then you're not with the group, and you're like, oh, I lost an hour on this really long race. And because you didn't train some anaerobic power, you didn't think it was going to be so punchy. And that little bit a minute, like, it just messes you up the whole time. Have you had that, Amber? Where, well, you probably know that. I mean, it didn't happen to you, of course, ever.
No, it's just one among a very long laundry list of mistakes that I've made over the years. Absolutely.
I feel like
my
that's
first A race.
Yeah. But actually, speaking of that, that's something I always find interesting, like with criteriums in particular, because it's the same course and similar races, and people say, well, the Cat 5s or the Cat 4s were just as fast as the Cat 2s or just as fast as something else. And it really doesn't matter if it's just as fast, because it's that selection point in the race that happens. That's the defining moment. So do you have the fitness, the strategy, and the skill to be able to actually make it past that 1 minute, right? Or whatever that decisive moment is in the race. That's the key. Chad's nodding. That's his jam. That's what he did for years of crit racing. So, okay,
John, you quit. Oh, can we talk about this? I don't have the doc up. You did a race, didn't you?
I did, yeah. Crit so last night I did short track. The night before I did the local crit, and we had Justin Rossi, Dave Christensen.
Oh, really?
We had it was everybody. We just missed Chad. That was it. But it was like a massive field. It was so much fun. I was super worried because I haven't been training at all because I have biceps tendonitis from swimming. Sorry for talking about swimming. I won't talk about it anymore. But so I haven't been able to train. And then I sold my road bike, didn't have my road bike. And then the weather was terrible, so I couldn't train inside. It was a nightmare. So I haven't been training, and I was really scared to see how I would do. But I actually hung in there really well with the crit. And looking back, I could have raced way more aggressively and probably split the race up a whole lot more. So I'm excited. It's good stuff. Let's get into James' question. Enough about me. James says, easy one for you, I hope. Can sweet spot workouts act as maintenance work for maintaining base or endurance fitness after the base phase has been completed? Or should this be done with longer, low intensity rides? Super good question. Chad, this seems like your wheelhouse.
Yeah, it is a good question. So James uses the term base endurance base / endurance fitness. And what he's really talking about is aerobic endurance. So, and it's just talked about it 100 times, 1,000 times. It's the ability to maintain a high percentage of your VO2 max. And we've even dedicated, I think, at least one deep dive and mentioned fractional utilization before. And we always put it in the context of FTP, but you can apply it to any power output, not just FTP. So it means one thing to have a high VO2 max, but entirely another to be able to operate at high percentages of that VO2 max. And what James is concerned with here is maintaining this high fractional utilization at an all-day pace, not at FTP. So basically, he's looking for higher aerobic watts. And so the idea being is, how much of your VO2 max can you comfortably sustain? So, and this is aerobic endurance versus FTP. What can you support when you're riding basically just this side of red line? So the real question is, can moderate intensity training, or we often refer to it as muscle endurance work, but it's just sweet spot work. Can that work maintain the aerobic endurance that he built during the base phase when he's in the build and the specialty phases? So let's start by recognizing something very important, and that's that maintenance is energy system specific. Okay. So you got to consider, in this case, a couple of things. First, what are, I guess, maybe the energy systems? And then next, what system or systems are touched by sweet spot work? So again, the question is, if muscle endurance work or sweet spot work will support or maintain adaptations gained during the aerobic endurance work, or really, it's kind of funny to say, but will the muscle endurance work support or maintain the adaptation that you gained doing muscle endurance work? Because if you're a TrainerRoad subscriber and you did sweet spot base 1 and 2, you didn't really do formal aerobic endurance, long, slow distance. You did sweet spot work. So he's asking, can you sustain aerobic endurance built by sweet spot with sweet spot? So pretty obviously, yes. But this brings us to probably the most relevant point, is that adaptations actually overlap energy systems. And Maxine, you can bring up that chart now. And Dr. Andrew Coggin actually spelled this out for us a few decades ago, quite a while back, with a chart titled Magnitude of Adaptations by Training Level. And it's a chart that, I'm thinking back to the 90s, that I've referred to it since then. Riders, coaches, it's been bandied about quite a bit because it succinctly sums up all the adaptations that happen across energy systems. And if you look at levels 2, 3, 4, and 5, we're basically, 2 is the aerobic endurance that you build through long, slow distance, 3 tempo, 4, you're into threshold. And then that border between 3 and 4, that sweet spot. So if you look at all the check marks that happen in 2, you get even more of them in 3, even more of them in 4. So with sweet spot being right there on the border between 3 and 4, you can bet you're touching all of those. You're touching the energy systems. You're stimulating particular adaptations, aerobic adaptations that come with your endurance training. So the takeaway is quite simply is what happens at lower intensities with greater volume also happens at higher intensities with less volume. And you look at, so again, aerobic endurance, we get more plasma volume, you get increased mitochondrial enzymes. You can just call them aerobic enzymes, increased lactate threshold, right? You can tolerate more lactate. You can process more lactate because again, you have more mitochondria, a bigger aerobic engine. Increase muscle glycogen storage, which is basically nature's form of carbohydrate loading. You get hypertrophy of your slow twitch fibers. So those really oxidative aerobic fibers get bigger, capable of greater force. I mean, all these things that happen with the long, slow distance also happen with the higher intensity work to some degree. So strictly speaking, the muscle endurance work or the sweet spot work is indeed likely to maintain the aerobic endurance you're talking about, just at a more physiologically and do respect a more psychologically taxing level, right? But are you looking to do muscle endurance or sweet spot work specifically? Because my suspicion here is he's looking to maintain his aerobic endurance, the high fractional utilization, and his VO2 max. So if the real goal is the maintenance of this aerobic endurance, this is addressed, both build and specialty. It's handled. So in the build phase, you're going to see probably some sweet spot work, but you're also going to see some threshold work, some VO2 max work. And look at that chart again. Those are columns 3 and 5. I mean, and all the check marks that overlap. And then when you move into specialty, still going to see some VO2 max. And that's pretty much across plans. I can't think of a single plan that leaves it out. And then you might see some anaerobic work. And again, look at it. Columns 5 and 6. All the check marks that are in column 2 are still represented in those later columns. So all of this work exposes the body to necessary aerobic system touch-ups. It's being handled. But with regards to sweet spot specifically, I'll just look at one study for this moderate dive here. And it's a study from way back in 1993, where McConnell and colleagues, it actually serves as a bit of a cautionary tale with respect to sweet spot. They took 10 well-conditioned male runners. And yeah, they were runners, but there's plenty of overlap. It's still endurance sport. They're still working at roughly the same, tolls on the body, same power levels if you do convert it to power. And what they had them do is 4 weeks of what they considered base training. And this amounted to 70 kilometers of running. And that's exactly or very close to what they were doing pre-study. And then this base training intensity distribution. So, what sort of intensities did they do across their base training phase amounted to 60% done at about 70 to 80% of their VO2 max. And if you'll forgive me and let me convert that to FTP, running FTP of that, 80 to 90% FTP. I mean, we're talking basically most of their training was done as muscle endurance or sweet spot work. And the runners, interestingly, considered this their easy pace, which I find is just a testament to how hard running is. that's what easy is. And then the remainder was actually done at higher intensities. So sweet spot was their base. And then after this 4 weeks of base training, they did 4 weeks. They reduced the load to only 35% of their total volume. They were only running 50% of the frequency. So half as many times during the week. And they were doing all the work at about 70% of VO2 max. So they trained at the lowest intensity from their base phase, which again, if you'll allow it, it kind of equates to about 80% of FTP. And what happened? Resting plasma volume, hemoglobin, hematocrit, resting heart rate, all remain unchanged. Treadmill VO2 max, treadmill submax VO2, and the ventilation and heart rate that went along with it, unchanged. But it's not all good news, because basically they became slightly more anaerobic. Body fat went up a little bit also. 5K times went up also. So 9 out of 10 of these runners actually got slower. So big reductions in a very important energy system's volume do require maintenance of intensity. This is a known thing. And it's why VO2 max work specifically is a repeat performer in the build and the specialty plans and in taper weeks. Same idea, less volume, keep the intensity. But I don't know that I would lay my maintenance concerns at the feet of sweet spot training in later training phases. And I have a few reasons for this. First of which is, as demonstrated just in that study right there, minimal sweet spot training actually led to slower athletes, and it did it over the course of just 4 weeks. Secondly, improvements in muscle endurance basically are followed by more muscle endurance work. If you get good at sweet spot work, the only way to improve your sweet spot response is to do more sweet spot work. And this can be really exhausting. Some disciplines escalating that sweet spot work makes perfect sense. Some phases of training escalating it makes perfect sense, but there are limits to sweet spots adaptation inducing capabilities. And then finally, and probably most obviously, you got to consider the nature of your most important events or endeavors. Let's just call them endeavors. I don't want to imply that they're always competitive, but long days in the saddle shouldn't come as a surprise on game day. And if you think of grand fondos or centuries, and it doesn't matter if they're metric or they're measured in freedom units, it doesn't matter if they're on the road, off road, if they're Ironman distance triathlons, stage races with multiple stages, multiple stages, Cape Epic actually springs to mind. Having the energy systems built up and touched up is only part of what's necessary to thrive during your events, or in some cases just survive. And long, slow distance actually exposes us to bodily stress. So if you think of all the little aches and pains that creep into your body over the course of, being above 2 hours, 3 hours, et cetera. Fueling challenges. You may have your fueling dialed when you're riding 2 or 3 hours, but what happens when you tack on that 4th or 5th hour? The mental hurdles, that ebb and flow that Amber's talked about, that we've talked about, where within the span of 10 minutes, you can go from your darkest moment to your brightest moment. It just, and it happens over and over and over. Deficiencies in bike fit become glaringly obvious over longer distances. And then even bike setup. If you think about how you would set up the same bike for something like Unbound, or God forbid, Unbound XL, or a trip up Mauna Kea, compare that to how you could set it up for just a 40-mile road race, right? So shorter events may not expose longer ride setup issues, something that's purely equipment related. So if you ask me, I see long rides as being completely vital in this whole fine tuning process, at least for longer events, should that be your aim.
This is one of the reasons why we have within the plans, like the ability to select workout alternates. And we even suggest if you are going through a plan, like you're saying, Chad, when you're going through a plan, being able to substitute out your weekend, like longer tempo ride or sweet spot ride, you can swap it out with a longer endurance workout. Mm-hmm. That said, I want to kind of take it back to something you said in the beginning here, Chad, that really so let's just say you don't have those other pieces in place, but you don't have the energy systems either. Or let's say you do have the other systems in place. Your bike fit's good. Your nutrition's good. You're comfortable on the bike for X amount of hours, whatever else. If you don't have the energy systems in place, if they aren't trained effectively, that's going to have a really bad effect on your performance. And I think that there's a tendency to get the focus wrong, for us to focus on all the other things and not focus on the training, and not focus on making sure that we're hitting our marks in the training. Nate, you're a good example actually of doing this correctly with Leadville, in the sense that you went into a really big ride. And I remember beforehand, you're like, I'm just really focusing in on those 2-hour, 3-hour sweet spot workouts and other like tempo workouts that you were doing within your plan. I think you were following the Century plan going into that one. And that was or the Gran Fondo plan, forgive me. That was your focus. And you ended up doing really well. I just screwed your race up with really hot hydration pack at the end.
It's still good. I still appreciate the other help. Yeah. And even in training, sometimes too, I would not go as hard with other people because I knew like, this is not the point of what today is. Two, with what I want to say something before. So I can still read in forums. Sometimes people say TrainerRoad is just sweet spot. That's all I do is sweet spot. That's not all we do is sweet spot. You gotta look at the whole plan and stuff, and the whole like phase and progression, what you do to your A race. And the one plan that does have the most sweet spot is sweet spot based high volume. And that is for the type of athlete who needs, maybe they're plateaued. They need this super compensation bump of a whole bunch of work. They wanna go a little bit deeper than they normally would, because they don't have the time to do those really long rides outside. Very, very small percentage of people. It's like less than 5% of our athletes. So the big ones are low volume, right? 3 days per week and mid volume. And those are the ones where, as Chad said, you can keep doing them and doing them. John, you've seen with Successful Athlete podcast, low volume people, like they win world championships, right? National championships.
Yeah.
What?
Yes. It's impressive.
It's crazy.
And it's funny. We're always, Amber, you probably have a much better term for this, but our perception is always influenced by everything that we see around us, right? Mm-hmm. And that actually really changed my perspective with the Successful Athletes podcast, because a lot of the people I'm around, it's like pro athletes and they're doing like a ton of training. And then I get in touch with a lot of these athletes via Successful Athletes podcast, and it's so cool to see that, oh, wait, actually a lot is possible with not very much. It's just really specific in terms of what you're doing. But that was a perspective shift for me, to see that. I can't emphasize this enough. Like and Chad's chart, the chart that Chad was mentioning that you can see here, you can see how intentional you can become with the outcomes of your training when you're working in these different zones. It's really clear. Like there are specific things you want to accomplish. If you spend time in those zones strategically, and as your training progresses, it's going to make sure that your time in that zone, or the repeatability that you need to have for race day, is going to get more and more specific, and you're going to get better and better at it. That is how you prepare for an event. Like, yes, you can add on all the other stuff, but in my opinion, that's icing on the cake when we're talking about the nutrition and everything else. And I'm sure if you have a terrible nutrition plan, it will sabotage even the best fitness. If you have a terrible execution plan in terms of pacing, equally, it will sabotage even the best fitness that you have. However, without the fitness, there's simply nothing to stand on. That's like your ladder, that's the building. And without the fitness, it's just not there. You can execute all you want, you can do all those things, but you can't hide. Eventually, the lack of fitness comes out. So it's super important. One detail also that I want to hit home on this as well is this is where progression levels are super, super helpful when we're talking about going through your training and saying, hey, look, in the sweet spot zone, I'm getting a big lift. In the threshold zone, I'm getting a big lift. And then as you get closer to your event, you're going to find that the zones that matter most for your event, that's what you're going to see improve. So it's really nice to be able to see that. So then when your VO2 is going up and you've got something like a crit coming up, that means that your repeatability and your ability to sustain that power, depending on the work that you're doing and what's prescribed to you in the plan, that is getting better. So it's kind of nice because sometimes if you just look at FTP, you don't have a clear indication of what's going on in terms of your fitness improving. But the progression levels tell you, if you look at this chart that Chad has, think of that when you see your progression levels going up. Oh, so I'm getting increased lactate threshold, increased muscle glycogen storage, increased muscle capillarization, all because that progression level is moving up. It's a really cool visualization of it.
Yeah. Okay. 3 things to say. First, low volume plan. We rename it to the best plan. And then high volume, we call it the elite plateau plan.
Actually,
right?
can we
awesome.
be transparent with plans here a little bit? Because we've actually thought about this. When we call it low volume, people don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a problem. I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts. Yeah, exactly.
It's relatively low.
Yes. I'd be curious to hear.
Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue though. The relatively low volume plan.
Mostly low. Yeah.
What we need is a lower volume plan that is actually low. I'm sorry, I'm on cell phone now, so I'm super delayed. I'll try to fix it between Chad's next deep dive.
It's actually funny, Nate, when you watch the YouTube live stream, I can see all the folks here, which by the way, if you're watching right now, we've had lots of folks join us. Give it a thumbs up. That way more cyclists will see it. So right now, thumbs up. But I see the viewership and sometimes YouTube has a glitch and it shows we go to 0 and go back. When you dropped out, it went to 0. So just saying, you have a big impact here. But that is a concern. So if you have thoughts on that, like what we should name these plans so that it doesn't discourage people, because nobody should feel ashamed. It's really your plan is highly individual and it should be what's right for you. And that's how you best improve. It's not about you relative to anybody else. So if you have thoughts on it, go to the TrainerRoad forum and let us know.
And some like 45-minute workouts or 30-minute workout plans, stuff like that. That's what Chad said, the maintenance and some intensity. Like if you want to have a little bit of break from training or a little bit of a reduction and focus on something else, like swimming, John, you can do 30-minute, 45-minute workouts and maintain a lot of stuff. We have bigger plans on this to make it all dynamic, but that's still coming down the line. But yeah, the name of like a low, I think another naming convention we thought is a low volume, medium, which is low volume, high is medium, and then the high one is called extreme, because it is extreme. We've been saying on the podcast a lot of times, but if we say higher, people don't get the context of what we write in the captions and the blog posts and the podcast and stuff. So we got to make sure we put context around that. 2, Chad talked about how in general, sweet spot can be taxing. Also, when you think about it, and especially with these studies, not all sweet spot work is created equal. And that's where progression levels come in. So if you do a level, let's say you're level 7, your progression level is level 7, and you do a level 7 sweet spot workout, it's pretty hard, right? If you are level 7, you do a level 4. So instead of going from let's say 3 by 20 minute sweet spots, it would be down to be like 4 by 10 or something. That's like a big difference. And the amount of recovery is much, much less. And that's where we call it, like, some workouts are achievable and some are productive. It's not just because you are working in the sweet spot zone, you therefore have this amount of recovery. It's much more complex than that. And that gets glossed over a lot. It's the duration of it and the amount of intervals. A lot of it's the sustained work and then where you are before that. And it's all relative and to where you are in your training phase and like what day of the week it is. All this stuff is relative to your recovery, and it's very complex. And that's what we try to build into. That's what we do build into adaptive training. So don't let that point gloss over that it's all the same, because it's not. Mm-hmm. Third, we have this internally, a fitness score. Have I talked about this before on the podcast? I'm not sure.
A long time ago when it was actually different than what it is now.
Yeah. So the issue that John just said, where you have your FTP and then your progressions level change, it's very hard to tell internally, like what your fitness is or how much it's increased. And we built this internally. We might test it where we add it to the end of a workout, but it's basically the combination of anaerobic VO2 max and threshold progression levels, how your FTP, and weight or not. And it's just a made up number that we have, but it's something you can track. So you can say that I got more fit, and you can, if your VO2 max goes up, your threshold stays the same. You can say, hey, I got this much more fit. We use science and stuff to figure it out, but it's just one number to look at that changes a lot. And I think people would like that. Again, let us know in the chat, forum, Instagram. That'd be really great to hear your thoughts.
New t-shirt idea. We use science and stuff.
I like it.
I really like that, actually.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah. All right, Greg's question. He says, hey, everyone, thanks for the continued support through all the TR channels. 5 stars, obviously. He's saying podcast ratings and app ratings, by the way. If you use the TrainerRoad app and like it, go rate it 5 stars. That's a huge help. And if you're listening to this podcast, go to Spotify. And by the way, it makes you listen to the podcast before you rate it. So kudos Spotify. I like that, instead of allowing for people to just like pay for fake reviews and stuff. So go there, listen to this podcast, and then you can rate it 5 stars. Please do that. That would help us a huge amount. I'm going to look at some point throughout this podcast where we're at on the tally live to give you an update, but we need to be the #1 rated cycling podcast because we are on iTunes and we need to be on Spotify. We don't support second place for us. It must be first. Okay. So he says, I continue to share the podcast. Thank you. That's huge with TR and TR with anyone that will listen. I'm finally stepping out of my comfort zone and trying my first race, the Tour of the Batten Kill in upstate New York. This is your turf, Amber. Have you done this race before?
I have been registered for it, and then unfortunately there have been circumstances that arose that I haven't done it yet. But yes, I'm very familiar with this course.
Okay, cool. So you'll have some good context for us. He says it's a 75-mile road race with 20 miles of hard-packed gravel sections, but nothing that will require more than 28-millimeter road tires and 5,000 feet of steep, punchy climbs. So that's a fair amount, and seems, because I've heard that the climbs are really steep. Is that correct, Amber?
Yes,
yeah.
And we will talk about that.
Okay, good. He says, I started watching videos and I have he says, Nate red strings on every wall of my house, which, by the way, we've mentioned this a few times from Always Sunny and Always Sunny. Please, Maxine, you can put up the screenshot now so then people on YouTube can see. I think that we were trying to Photoshop your face onto there too, Nate, but I'm not sure it got done in time. But he says, I started watching videos. I have my Nate red strings on every wall of my house. And I was just curious, with all of your combined experience, any tips you might have for a first race and maybe some things to expect. The winner will finish somewhere around 3:30, and my goal is to hang on with the main group as long as possible and hopefully finish around 4 hours. That would be a really good ride for me. My fear is about how competitive people will be, not so much about bumping elbows or yelling to take a turn on the front. I bet that'll happen, by the way. But what about rest stops? He says, I can't ride for 4 hours on 2 bottles, and my fueling plan will rely on getting 80 grams of carbs per bottle per hour based on how I've been training. I might only have to stop once, but I will need to stop. So do people stop? I don't have a team or anyone to help me, so I'll need to pull over to fill bottles. Will that mark the end of my race? And how do you all find that normally works out on a road race? Any other tips or info you have for a newbie would be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much. Amber, take us away. What do you think on this specific race? And then we can get into the general aspects of feed zone complications.
Yeah, absolutely. So this race has been around for a really long time, and it's been around in multiple forms. So many, many years ago, it was your classic road race where it's a mass start road race. Like any other road race. But in recent years, they've shifted to a different format where it's not like a classic road race. So it is a mass start road race, but it's like a mass start Grand Fondo versus a mass start road race. So there's a little bit of a difference here. And I do want to go into that now because that will better frame some of my answers to these questions. So in a classic road race, you have one category racing at each time. That entire category is racing for the win, and the first person across the line wins the race. Those are really structured. There's a course. There's usually neutral feed zones. And in a neutral feed zone in a classic road race scenario, there are volunteers who have water bottles that you can grab as you ride by. So there's no stopping at an aid station, but you can grab bottles as you're riding past and through the feed zone. In those race is also, in addition to neutral support, if you're there with a team and you have a staff member or a friend who can be in the feed zone to give you bottles that you may have prepared ahead of time, they'll hold that bottle out as you're riding by and you can grab it and you don't have to stop, but you can get those extra bottles later in the race as you need them. So that's what a classic road race is. So the new format of Tour of the Bat and Kill is more like a Gran Fondo, where there are aid stations, and those would require stopping. To be honest with you, I am not sure if they have neutral feeding zones. I would assume that that's possibly not the case, but I would double check that and just make sure that you know ahead of time if it's possible to grab a neutral feed somewhere, if the feed zone is a rolling feed zone or if it is an aid station where you need to stop. And in any case, whatever the format is, everyone's going to be in the same boat. So if there are feed zones, hopefully there are volunteers there offering neutral support. If there aren't, there's probably going to be more than one athlete who's registered for the race who's in the same boat as you. You might be able to take a hydration pack and be a little bit more self-sufficient. That would be one option. But I would look into that and just know ahead of time of exactly what your options are going to be so you can plan for that. Yeah, Jonathan.
One thought that I, forgive me, one thought that I have on this, Amber, is to have like a plan B in place or a plan A with this. Because I'm hearing you talk about this, and it's super good advice. And to act on it, a good way to do it is to say, well, let's just assume there are no neutral bottles. What's my plan going to be? And then make a plan that says, okay, let's assume there are neutral bottles. What's my plan going to be? Because Nate and I have made this mistake when we've traveled to races before. I'm thinking of, I think like Valley of the Sun, maybe we did this, I can't remember, but where we go with a plan in place and then we show up and we read the tech guide, or we just find out due to the riders meeting or something else that plan has changed. And suddenly we need like a backup. And since then I've said, okay, what's my plan if they do give me neutral? What's my plan if they don't give me neutral? And making sure that I have everything in place for that. Because like you said, it also could change too, right? Like, you show up and they're all out of neutral bottles for one reason or another.
Usually the neutral bottles are water only. So this athlete's talking about having calories in the bottles, and that is a different scenario, right? So grabbing a neutral bottle that's going to be just water is maybe could throw your fueling strategy off if you're depending on having calories in your bottles. So if you don't have the opportunity to prepare a bottle ahead of time and have it in the feed zone, that's going to impact your fueling strategy. Likewise with a hydration pack, it's not always best practice to put mix and carbohydrate in a hydration pack. So these are all things that you're going to want to consider, and ultimately it's got to be what's going to work for you. So I would suggest maybe part of your plan B is having some food in your pockets, where if you're able to get water and get that hydration, you can still get the calories in if you need them, even if you're not getting those calories from a bottle. In a race format like this, you're asking about how people are competitive. People are competitive. And what I really love is at Rooted Vermont, they have what they call the mullet protocol, which is business in the front and party in the back. So it's a similar format where everybody starts at the same time. And there's going to be a group of people who are competitive who really want to go for the win. And they're going to be racing at the front of the race. But you're also going to have large numbers of people who are out there to enjoy the scenery and just enjoy being on their bike and have a social ride and stop and take pictures and really enjoy the fare at the aid stations. So probably you're going to have a similar mix at this event. So the closer you stay to the front, the more serious those folks are going to be and the more focused on racing those folks are going to be. You mentioned that your goal is to finish somewhere within a half an hour of the lead riders. These races tend to break up a lot. So chances are you will end up riding with a smallish group of people who have a similar goal and similar fitness to you. So number one is there are very, very few things that will absolutely spell the end of your race. So if for some reason you need to stop at an aid station to fuel or grab something and you lose contact with the group that you were with, it doesn't mean that you can't catch back up to them. It doesn't mean that they're going to slow way down because they're super dehydrated because they didn't stop to get a hydration refill. There's so much that can happen in these races. So I would suggest that, mentally prepare yourself for things to not go to plan, but also mentally prepare yourself to keep the faith for the entire race. Like it's never too late to keep trying, and you don't know what can happen in these types of races. I've got a couple other tips, but I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I want to throw this back and see if anybody else has some comments.
I actually
Please
wanted to
do.
see if Chad, yeah, whoa, Nate isn't frozen. He's visually frozen, but he's actually there. Oh,
Okay.
that's a shock.
That's weird.
I was just going to ask if Chad had any thoughts yet, because otherwise, Amber, carry on.
I do have one thought, and let's, I kind of want to extend the mullet analogy just a bit, because the mullet's a whole hairdo, right? I mean, you have the business in the front,
The
and the guys who
irony
are
of Chad talking about this.
I mean, but there are people who are really hotly contesting it, who have a race strategy planned out, have their nutrition dialed for a anticipated finish time. They've got all their ducks in a row. And there are other people who are full on party, just want to play, enjoy the day as much as possible, snap the photos, soak up conversation at aid stations, all those things. And then there are the people in between. And I consider myself one of those people in between. And I think a lot of people are, where they're not out there to totally kill it, but they are out there to put in what they consider a respectable time. They want to work hard the whole time. They want to get everything right. They want to minimize downtime, stop time. And I want to use them as an example of who can benefit most from the short breaks that you get at aid stations. And it very much ties with what Nate just said, how sweet spot training is not created equal, because you can do a 60-minute block at 90% of your threshold, and it will just grind you down. Heart rate goes up, perceived exertion goes up. You're just hating life as it gets longer and longer. But if you take that same 60 minutes and break it up into 10-minute blocks with 2-minute breaks in between, you enter each of those 10 minutes revitalized. You feel better about it. You enjoy at least some of that next 10 minutes more than you would have otherwise. And the same idea carries to events like this. You get to that aid station, you might be a bit beat down, maybe a lot beat down as the event goes on, but you get really refreshed from just taking a little time off the bike, quick stretch, grab a banana, refill your bottle with some water and some carbo fluid, whatever it may be, and then get going again, and you're revitalized. And it can drastically not only transform your experience, make it that much more positive and memorable, happily memorable, but you can also go faster than you would have otherwise. Rather than just grinding yourself down, those little breaks could actually help you keep up a higher pace when you are on the bike. So it's a win-win.
Yeah. I second all of that for sure. So to the answer, do people stop? Yes, some do, and some probably won't. So it's, you have to do what's going to be best for you. And I really like what Chad just said, and I would encourage you to go ahead and stop. And you'd be surprised at how much you can accomplish in 30 seconds or under a minute. Grabbing a new bottle, refilling the bottle, grabbing a snack, throwing it in your pocket, getting back on the bike and going. It doesn't have to be really long, and it doesn't have to open up a massive gap on the group you were just with. You can also talk to the people in the group that you're with and just say, hey, are you guys planning to stop at this aid station? And usually there's going to be more than one, so you might not stop at every single station. You might have an agreement in your group of like, hey, we've really been working well together. We want to keep this going. Let's stop for 30 seconds, fill up our bottles, and keep going. There's a whole host of things that can happen. So I would go into this feeling really positive. Like I wouldn't feel worried about the competitive aspect of this, because these types of events are really hard, and you might find that there's a lot more cooperation in these than there is. People are competitive, but working together over courses like this is usually to everybody's benefit if your goal is to get a good time. So there will be lots of moments on the course where your interests are actually aligned with your competitors, and you can actually work together to help each other get a good time. One of the other questions, let's see, that you asked here. Oh, you didn't ask this question specifically, but this kind of goes to what to expect in a first race. And this race in particular, you mentioned steep, punchy climbs. I cannot emphasize the steep aspect of that enough. This course is wild for that. So the terrain that you're going to be racing on is very different from a lot of the terrain that we see in American racing in general. So I think of classic climbing races like Redlands, Tour of the Gila, Cascade, big, long climbs. Those climbs are all terribly gradual compared to what you're about to face. You will be seeing gradients consistently of 17 to over 20%. In some cases, maybe even over 24%. They're short, but they are super steep. And those are going to be the sections that are going to create the most separation, I would wager. So probably one of the best things you can do to prepare for this race is to go get the biggest cassette that you can find, and get yourself really good mountain climbing gearing. It might even be worth getting a long cage derailleur so that you can accommodate even more gears in the back, because on those steep sections, people will be overgeared. They'll have to stop. They'll have to walk. You want to be really prepared for those selection points. Yeah, Jonathan.
Dare we bring up the mullet again? This is going to be the
Let's
mullet
bring up the mullet as much as we can.
Yeah.
You dare.
Yeah, because now with wireless shifting, especially with SRAM stuff, it's actually pretty easy to use road shifters and then have something that goes up to like a 36 to a 42 to all the way up to a 50 or a 52.
Yes.
This sounds like a course like this. And this is, I bet, this is an assumption, but I'm going to make the assumption just the same.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Inflame. Okay. So if you stop to fill up your bottles, I bet that you would lose less time to do that if you paced properly than just focusing on trying to get up those climbs quickly and following everybody else's pace. Because every time you go up those steep climbs, right, Amber, like if it's 24%, you're not able to, like, even with really low gearing, you'll probably be at threshold. So imagine if you were just trying to keep pace with everybody else, you'd be way above threshold. So do whatever like steady state work you've done, and think of that workout that you did that was like a hard tempo workout, hard sweet spot workout, even a hard endurance workout. And then say, okay, now add in 75 surges that were 30 seconds to a minute that were way over a threshold. That ride would feel totally different and you wouldn't be able to hold the same intensity. So you have to coalesce. You have to say, okay, I'm going to let go of speed for a bit. Speed's going to be what it is. And instead, I'm going to focus on my power and trying to stay within myself as much as possible, because otherwise, that's the really big thing with this race that I see where you could lose time. That's going to hurt you more.
Big time.
Being in this, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I said I've been in this.
The latency. Nate, we'll have Nate go, and then Amber will chime in afterwards.
Okay, hopefully my internet is better now. I switched it, but I've been in this position. I don't know if Amber's been in this position in her life where you're not in the lead group, like, but there's this no man's land of around like 4 watts per kilo for a man, where there's not where everyone else is, but you're not with the elite group. And it's very hard to find and like link up with people, especially on these longer races. And if there are steep, punchy parts, that's even harder too. And this is my strategy as a bigger person. And I think you have a different strategy as a lighter person. Like, is your strength the flats or the climbs? If your strength are the climbs, what I would do is try to find a group with bigger people who are going to like really pull it on the flats. And then on the climbs, you're not going to punch it. You're going to sit in that group and make it go a little bit slower, so that when it is the flats, you get this huge benefit of a train, and you're going to be a leader and you're going to motivate them, and you're going to take your pulls and you're going to just go everyone through and make everyone happy and talk about it the whole time. You will go so much faster like that, because it makes no sense to, people do this to me all the time. They'll like drop me on a climb. I'll catch them like 3 or 4 minutes later on a flat. And why did they do all that extra work when they could have been with me? As a big person on that climb, you cannot, John alluded to this in Amber, you cannot go with them. Like, you just have to let them go. Another group will come. And also sometimes on the flats, you just have to leave the group. Like, they will not follow you. They don't want to go that hard, because as a bigger person, like, you'll put out more watts on that. You might be putting out their FTP right on the flats and be aero. You might have a 200, your aerobic work might be 250, and that might be their FTP as a smaller person, and they might still beat you on a climb. So I think it's better. You got to know when to drop the group, and you got to know, that's pretty much it. You got to know when to drop the group and when you should not drop the group. And you'll learn that over time, but it's really, man, even Leadville's a long course, but I think I've never ridden with a group the whole time. It's always like 30 minutes and then something happens. And at aid station, there's always a group behind you. Let them catch up and you go with them too. That's always a perfectly valid strategy.
To be fair, we don't know about this athlete's relative strength. So this person might actually be a really, really strong climber, and that's their wheelhouse. I would say, even if that's the case, be conservative on those early climbs and check out the course ahead of time so you know how many of these punchy climbs you're going to be hitting. And even if you are a really strong climber, I think what Jonathan and Nate have just said still applies, because you want to save your matches for those last punchy climbs, because you know that everybody's going to be pushing hard on the early ones. It's going to be trashing their legs and loading them up, and then they're going to be less fresh for the later climbs. And if that's where you really want to be fresh. So that goes to pacing and that goes to gearing, because you can really save your legs a lot by having a variety of gear choices, especially on those earlier climbs. And then if you decide that you're feeling good later on and you want to push it on a climb, you'll have the legs to do that. You'll be fresher relative to everybody around you. So I would definitely have a conservative approach in the first half of the race.
And there are a few things more satisfying than picking people off who dropped you earlier because they paced poorly.
So true.
This actually has me thinking about Chad's conversation last week when we were talking, I think it was last week. Geez, might be time warping here, but when we were talking about aerobic versus anaerobic. So Amber, you just said on the final climbs, because that's typically where like decisions or decisive moments land. But to be fair, the decisive moment, if you're really going, once again, if you're business in the front, not party in the back, right? If you're business in the front with this race, the decisive moment could come at any point in the race. Really, it's the stacking of efforts that can create that perfect cocktail to be able to make the race decisive. Sometimes it's not just that they come late in the race. It's not that they're particularly hard. I don't know how many times I've been spit off the back of a group in the spot that I absolutely did not think was going to be decisive, right? It happens at other moments. And it's just because of the stacking order. If we think about the discussion that Chad was having on anaerobic efforts and being able to build your repeatability with those efforts and then back them up with aerobic endurance to be able to make that all possible. If you have more aerobic fitness than somebody else on some of these punchy, climby courses, then it's really not about perhaps laying down the hardest attack, but it's just having a good read on when the race is hard and when the temperatures are starting to ramp up, so to speak, right, on the race. And when it's starting to ramp up, Amber's nodding because this is literally her job, was to like know exactly when the race is doing this and to make it happen. But and that's usually a really good time. If you attack when it's most obvious, everyone's expecting that. But if you just go through the race and you have a really good read on, okay, people are starting to actually slow down a bit more than I anticipated, and they're not accelerating over the top of the climbs anymore, and they're resting over the top of the climbs. That's a good sign if you're the sort of person that can split up the race, because then at that point, just ratchet up the intensity a bit more as long as it's within your wheelhouse, ratchet it up a bit more. And that's when people will start to fall off. Because the big thing is if you can spit people off with these climbing courses, but then get to the finish and still have something in reserve instead of spending it all on just a huge attack at some point earlier on in the course, you'll be really set. So it really is like it's always attrition in cycling, but it's just magnified with these climbing courses. Perhaps one point to kind of tie this full circle too is that in events like that, you're going really high up in intensity. You're burning a lot of sugar. Like it's going to happen because it's so much intensity. And these races, it's just so important to make sure that all of them take in fuel, but on this one, if you don't, it will become very apparent if you're not fueling adequately. And my suggestion in this case, Greg, since you are unaware of, or perhaps unaware, maybe you are, but you didn't communicate it with us with a fueling strategy. Amber had a great point on making sure you're taking calories with you that you can control rather than relying on calories later on. So that for me in this case would look like I'm going to bring a lot of gels. And I'm going to be able to take in those gels just in case I can't, I don't have the time to stop and mix a bottle if that's the case, if that's your situation. So then that way I can just grab water and then take in the calories separately. So super interesting to think through these race execution things like this.
Yeah, I just want to get very explicit about gearing. A 28 in the back is not going to be enough for you. So if you're not sure what that means, I would take that phrase to your local bike shop. It means there's 28 teeth on the biggest cog on the cassette in the back. You're going to want a lot more than that. So it would be worth asking your local bike shop what they could do for you to get you more gearing for this race, because that's going to be a really, really big factor for you. But yeah, I think I'm really excited for you. I think this is going to be super fun. The competitive aspect is actually really fun in these races. So I wouldn't, absolutely, you mentioned elbows. Don't worry about elbows. remember that this is a mullet protocol. So there's going to be people who are really racing the front, but you'll find your people. You will find your people on this course, and have fun with them. And you can have fun going for a great time. Just get those people around you who are like-minded, hype each other up, have fun hyping each other up and working together on this course. It'll be really fun. And looking for selection points on these really steep things, people will be focused on the steep parts of the climbs. But like Jonathan mentioned in passing, this is a really key point. The hardest part is often just after that climb, because people will be putting out so many watts just to go up the climb at whatever speed they think they need to. And then it's right after that is people will mentally feel like they're done, in air quotes, once they reach the crest of the climb. So they will mentally check out and back off a little bit. And that's the moment where if you're feeling good, push it just a little bit. You could really crack some people mentally. If you're not feeling good, mentally prepare yourself and be aware that somebody else might do that. So if you're mentally anticipating that you might have to push a little bit more over the crest of the climb, if someone does that, you will be ready. It won't take you by surprise and it won't crack you mentally. So I would just keep that in mind. Either be the person doing that or anticipate that somebody might, so that you're mentally prepared for it.
Awesome. Good luck, Greg. Exciting.
Yeah.
Derek's question. He says, I'm currently on the mid-volume triathlon plan. Audience boos and throws rotten vegetables, he says.
No.
I think he's saying that because of how people have reacted to my triathlon talk. Training Tuesday through Sunday, and just started a physically demanding job as a massage therapist working Wednesday through Monday. So I'm going to reiterate that. Training Tuesday through Sunday. And he says, just started physically demanding job as a massage therapist working Wednesday to Monday. My question is, am I digging myself into a hole by not having a truly dedicated recovery day where I'm not demanding something of my body? I don't necessarily want my recovery day to also be my off day, as I like the extra time to get in a longer ride or weight training session. This is when real life hits training, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't
Yeah.
get to pick all the time when we have the perfect schedule to be able to do what we want to do. Chad, I'm sure we can go into like the whole question of, do you need an absolute rest day? And then we can go into plenty of advice on what to do with your training plan thereafter, I'm sure.
Sure. Yeah. First off, this is a question I've wondered about many times, and not super recently, because I think I've figured it out. But I've had too many recovery days where I feel great, and it seems like a big waste to not make hay, as it were. And then plenty of times where the recovery day made perfect sense. And this just brings me to the first point: is that recovery is a constantly moving target, because context. It's always context. And it's influenced by numerous factors. Just look at a couple: sleep, nutrition and hydration, age, allostatic load. And the allostatic load we've talked about before, it's just life's other stressors. So basically everything that happens off the bike, out of the gym, can come at you from a million directions, and it influences how well you respond to your training, how quickly you recover. And of course, your training and competition loads. So as anyone who's trained with any level of regularity, recovery's necessity is contingent upon the training stress you inflict. No one who's been through this needs to be told that. For instance, you could do an endurance block, many days in a row of multi-hour rides, whether it's 3 hours or 6 hours, whatever it is you can tolerate, and do it day in, day out. Stack that against a workout where you just do a couple of sprint workouts, 6 30-second sprints separated by 4 or 5 minutes rest, takes 30 minutes. You rest a day and you do it again. It's another 30-minute workout for a total of an hour's worth of work. The comparison between the two is super tricky to make. They're very different brands of fatigue. And because of that, the recovery that goes with them is different. And then when you look at it from a competition perspective, and I think most people measure their competition stress along with their training stress. It's all TSS at the end of the week. It all gets lumped in there. I think most people get that right. But do consider how you orient or organize that racing across your training week. I mean, do you have a single weekly race? Maybe you're just doing a Tuesday night crit. Do you have bi-weekly racing where you're doing that Tuesday night crit and then you have a Saturday race? Or what about bi-weekly racing where your racing falls on Saturday and Sunday and it's back to back? All come with distinctly different recovery trajectories, and with them, their own recovery requirements. So with that in mind, let's just talk about some of the objectives of recovery. And first is the most obvious, the most general. We're trying to optimize the adaptive response to the training we're doing. If we get more granular with it, We're looking at healing, if we inflicted actual muscular damage. We're looking at replenishment of energy stores, recovery of any neurological deficit, something that probably doesn't register with a lot of people. Reattainment of your prior psychological state, how good you were feeling going into the workout, how oriented you were psychologically prior to the workout. Can you recapture that after the workout or on a recovery day? So all of these influences in some anyway, or on the need for recovery. Actually, outside of that, we can also look at age, nutrition, and performance. Performance outcomes, neurological needs, mental fatigue, and we'll cap it there. So I'm just going to touch on a few of these, each of them with a study, just to kind of demonstrate the point that I'm eventually going to get to. First off, from the age perspective, there's a 2015 study with Herbert and colleagues, and they use high intensity training, the recovery in particular, and looked at it in older men. And it was a randomized crossover design. They used men on the later age of things, 60s, and then men on the earlier end of the age spectrum in their early 20s. They had to have engaged in structured training. Five of the older gentlemen, that is, were international masters athletes. So these were considered trained subjects, very, very applicable to most of whom we're speaking to. They had them do 6 30-second sprints, and they did it at 50% of their peak power output. So if they did a PPO test and they could do 1200 watts, they're going to do 6 30-second repeats at 600 watts. Then recover 3 minutes in between. So it's a pretty typical high intensity training protocol. They followed this with either 3 days or 5 days of recovery. Then they had a 7-day washout, and then they did the alternate protocol. And what they found is that, no surprise, the younger group bounced back a little quicker. They bounced back after 3 days. The older group took 5 days. So real simple takeaway here is that age influences your recovery needs. Then when traversing the figurative minefield that's sports nutrition, I'm just going to look at one study from 2018 by Owens and colleagues. And I like this one in particular because it reminds us of the tricky balance between maximizing the adaptive response to training versus tamping it down with our nutrition. And on top of that, our timing of that nutrition. And a real simple takeaway here is what we eat, and when we eat it, can either lend itself to our sought after adaptation. It can also hinder it. I think of antioxidants, carbohydrate timing, all these things. And then in terms of performance measures, let's just look at that peak power output that I just talked about with a 2019 study from Yasar and colleagues, where they observed the recovery of peak power output following sprint intensity training. And this is a real similar protocol to the high intensity training one I just talked about. This time they used older, and this time the men were between 60 and 80 years of age versus younger in their 20s. So way up at the high end of the age spectrum and way down on it. Had to be habitually active, exercise at least 2 times a week, at least 150 minutes moderate exercise per week. And the question was, did the subjects derive the necessary recovery post sprint training with 3 days or 5 days? So again, 2 sessions. This time they were just 20-second sprints, but they were done all out. So imagine that 1200 peak power output. Now they have to go for that. They're going to hold 1200 for as long as they can. Then they're going to cling to whatever's left for the remainder of the 20 seconds. Another randomized. Yeah, oh no, it's brutal.
Real hard.
It's another randomized crossover design. So everyone did everything. Selection was randomized. Sounds really familiar, right? It's just like that other study. And again, not a big surprise. There was lower peak power output in the older subjects. Perhaps surprising, however, is that regardless of age, it took 3 days for 3 days of recovery for them to reclaim their peak power output. So both young and old, neither of them required 5 days. So in this case, sprint intensity training versus high intensity training, old and young actually recovered at the same rate. So takeaway here, recovery needs aren't always as straightforward as you might expect. And then from a neurological perspective, just going to point the conversation around the question of whether fatigue is centrally or peripherally mediated. Is it in the brain? Is it in the muscles? A bit of both, to what degrees? Because strong arguments exist on both sides of this matter. And that suggests to me that, at least in some ways, the brain and all the influence it exerts on the countless physiological goings on relies on recovery. I'll just leave it at that. And then finally, Pajot and Lepers in 2018 looked at mental fatigue's effect on sport performance. And they looked at 29 total studies, 17 of which were specifically targeting endurance performance, or looked at endurance performance. And they basically supported that mental fatigue decreases time to exhaustion when we're doing constant load exercise or efforts, basically anything that's evenly paced. Negatively impacted incremental exercise performance. So think a ramp test, but outside of the context of a ramp test, apply it to the real world, because this stuff happens all the time. If you're riding up a climb, you're the rider in front, and you gradually nudge up the pace and settle in. Nudge up the pace, settle in. Meanwhile, riders are coming unhitched and back. That's effectively an incremental display of or usage of power. On the flip side of that, you could be the rider who's trying not to get tailed off. Power goes up, you hang on. Power goes up, you hang on, hoping that the rider who's doling out this pain is going to crack before you do. The ability to self-pace is harmed as well. It's termed the self-regulation of cycling power output. And examples here are time trials or triathlons, where you have to pace over multiple disciplines. And then even further on the submaximal side of things, look at Grand Fondos, look at centuries, because they require very long pacing strategies. And then mental fatigue can also affect a whole lot of short-term miscellany. And the most relevant would be force, power, and speed maintained for as long as possible. What we refer to as endurance performance. And then finally, another relevant form of mental performance is decision-making performance. And this, depending on the event type, if you're a criterium racer, cross-country mountain bike, enduro, short track mountain bike, road racing, and really even technical time trials could fall into this. Draft legal triathlons would certainly qualify. They all rely on the ability to effectively make the right decisions, and often in the briefest of timeframes. So mental fatigue, improperly recovered, can absolutely affect performance on the mental side of things. So my overall message.
Oh, I was going to say, where have we heard talk about cognitive load before? Have we covered that here yet?
I don't know.
I don't think it's ever
like
mentioned on the podcast, actually. How tall are you, Nate, by the way? Yeah.
Okay, so I'll wrap it up with my overall message.
Please, Chad, go ahead. I'm sorry. We're disobedient children in school.
Wrapping it up. So how do we right this ship? It's simple as properly balancing our stress with our recovery, right? We do this with sleep, nutrition and hydration, stress management, mental downtime. I mean, it's just good old fashioned R&R, okay? Rest and relaxation. And these are all things that are easier to keep in line or to get back in line on dedicated recovery days. It doesn't make them a necessity, just a very strong recommendation, at least from this one coach. And yeah, this assumes your lifestyle affords you the luxury, because I know we don't all have the gift of full days to use for recovery.
So wrapping this back to Derek's question and what they asked, is a full day necessary, Chad, of recovery?
Maybe.
Depends.
Again, there's 100 contextual considerations to make. It's sure. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary. Sometimes, like I said, you wake up and you just feel great on that recovery day.
I generally just would say that it's good advice to have a day where my life would come unraveled personally if I didn't have one day to take care of the rest of the things that I don't do because I'm training. And that's actually, it's funny. We tend to talk about training in a vacuum from life. However, they're absolutely inseparable. And there's always a certain element of give and take to it. So if you try to fit too much in, and you set training as like a high priority, and you set it as a higher priority over other things, it will affect your training adversely eventually, even if it doesn't at first. So there's that side of it, almost like the logistics of life and making sure that they're operating effectively. It's nice to have a day off for that in that regard. That said, I'm thinking about this too. And this is a demanding job. Mm-hmm. Being a massage therapist, like that, you've got to be pretty darn tired after working on people all day. You're standing on your feet probably all day. Hopefully you have really good shoes and like a soft floor mat or something to stand on, but that's got to be really tiring. So and I also don't want to downplay the effect of even, and I'm going to say this in air quotes, a desk job can be extremely tiring. The amount of cognitive load that it requires to go through and to manage that, and the stress that's involved with work, everything else. But this one, compounding to that, they're on their feet, probably having to be social and have conversations with people too. And it's probably really tough. So Derek, in this case, we talked about low volume plans earlier. This might be a great chance for you to work on a low volume plan, see how it works if you give yourself a little extra time off. Chad just mentioned a bunch of studies. I'm not saying that you should, perform your own study, but you can perform your own experiment and you can see what happens. And maybe you can change it up and see if it helps. Amber, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I'd just like to say there's a lot of ways of approaching this, right? Like a day completely off is one way of managing your recovery, but there's a lot of other ways, which Chad just went over. I mean, there's nutrition, there's mental load. I mean, there's a whole host of other things that you can do to support your recovery within your life and within the constraints within your life. The other thing is you don't necessarily have to have a day off every week. So your question was, am I digging myself into a hole by not having a truly dedicated recovery day? You might be, and you would know that if you were. You also might, you might not be, and this might be working for you. So it's worth maybe experimenting with once in a while having a full day off and see how that feels. Do you feel substantially better? Maybe you only need a full day off every other week. It depends on what's going on in your life. Maybe you had a really, really stressful week, and that week you're like, okay, I'm not going to do my long ride. I'm going to take the day off instead. You can play around with this in terms of the context of your life and really, step into that role of expert on you. How are you feeling? Do you feel like you're going into a hole? Because if you don't feel like you're going into a hole and this is working for you, then maybe you don't need to fix something that's not broken. On the other hand, maybe you've been sliding so gradually into a hole you don't notice it yet, and with some extra rest you might feel worlds better. Who knows? It's hard for us to say because we don't know all of the other factors that are going on. But just because the constraints in your life don't necessarily allow this, because I'm sure there are some people listening who they don't have an opportunity to take a day off every day or every week. That doesn't mean that you can't get effective training. It doesn't mean that you can't effectively support your recovery, because like we said, that there are a lot of different ways of approaching this. So that self-experimentation is really important, and being really honest with yourself about how you are feeling.
Good advice. Nate, do you have anything to add?
Nope.
I'm so nervous to call on
just kidding.
you.
I know. Is it better now? Does it sound better?
It seems like it's great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've been quiet because I don't want to mess up the podcast. But in general, what I do, play on the razor's edge. You cut yourself a lot, right? So what John said, the way to, it's all about consistency over time, and having a little more rest is going to put you so much farther ahead, so that you don't go over and then you're like, oh, now I burn out. Now I have to take a week off. Now I have to take a month out. Now I can't finish my productive workouts. Your body has to absorb the stress, and I would just focus on that entire day off. And yeah, you get in that state where you're addicted to fitness. I have to do something. The thing that you should think in your head is you have to rest. That's your thing, is to chill and not do anything. So yeah, I like the idea of having that rest and just being fully rested. On
Nate's point, do what you can to build your life to allow consistency, right, Nate? That's
right.
And that I'm going to share this next week on the podcast, so stay tuned for this. But because I don't want to miscite the data, and I don't have it in front of me right now. But one of our amazing engineers, Alhan, and I were looking at data, and we were looking at, because we mentioned this on the podcast. I don't know everybody. It's not super exciting to hear that consistency is the thing that makes the biggest difference, but it really is. And we were looking at that though, and we looked at it in the terms of a person's average consistency rate over a year. And what we were looking at is their training load consistency. We weren't looking at how many workouts they hit versus how many they didn't hit, but we were looking at their training load consistency. And we were looking at a year, and then we were looking at the low month of the year. So that the month that deviated the most from it. And if that month deviated, it was pretty profound. But we basically found that if that month deviated, I think it was within 74% of the average, the athletes were actually much less likely to see improvement than if they were to keep that deviated month, that low month, within, I think it was 94%, was we looked at that as kind of the high ceiling. And those athletes were much more likely to improve. Now, this also looks at, it's key that, you don't just train year round nonstop, that you make sure you take some time. But we've talked about this before. A lot can be accomplished in a week to 2 weeks, where you take that time off and you can change that around. But it's interesting data because it really hits home the point that consistency matters on a day-to-day schedule. It's like that micro and meso cycle that we're in, macro cycle that we're dealing with. It operates on those different scales too. It compounds. When you can carry consistency all the time, you do better. And I think that's why so many successful athletes podcast guests that we had followed the low volume plan and had such great success, because it allowed them to be able to train consistently and hit their marks over the course of time. It wasn't that they were doing a ton of training just before an event, and then as a result, they got faster. In fact, I can't think of a single example of an athlete that we had that did that, even though that's all of our natural tendency to do that. Instead, they were just years of just hitting their marks, and low volume plan makes it easy.
There are clear psychological impacts too that mirror those physiological benefits. So there are physiological benefits to being consistent, but also psychological ones. Because if you are hitting your marks consistently, all of those small wins, they all contribute to building and maintaining motivation. They contribute to building and maintaining confidence. It's a huge boon to maintain a positive psychological mindset for every time you step onto the bike the next time. So all of that just creates a wonderful, positive, virtuous cycle of physiological and psychological benefits.
Or even just getting onto the bike, because if you have a 2-week lapse in your training, getting onto the bike is way harder than if you have a 1 or 2 day lapse in your training. I mean, when you're on it consistently, it's so easy just to repeat that habit, that pattern of action. Whereas if you have those breaks, not only are you detraining in the process, but the prospect of getting back on there and trying to rekindle what you maybe have built and probably lost just tears you down. It makes it really hard to begin again. And I say this because I'm in that exact position.
I was just going to say, get out of my head, Chad. That's right where I'm at right now.
Really personal.
John, when you talked about that 94%, you're not talking about they only dropped like 6% of total TSS, right? You're talking about like the percentage of like that population who dropped a certain amount. And that's the data if
they fell off 6% versus 24%.
Yeah,
26%.
We'll look at the data. I'm going to make sure. Okay. I will double check next week. So tune in next week. I don't want to say something I didn't, but I'm not talking about just TSS dropping. We'll go over that next week.
Yeah. So I just don't want anyone to, cause I saw it in the chat. I don't want anyone to take away to be like, oh, I've been doing 400s and I only want to drop this percentage during this time and this and that. And like, it's not what John's point is that the people who are more consistent over the year do the best versus people who go up and down.
Yes, exactly right. That's the point. And it's also TSS, all TSS isn't created equal. We've mentioned that plenty of times on the podcast, right? So you may be, that's probably a totally different ball of wax. We don't need to get into.
Those rest weeks where your TSS is lower are what enable you to be consistent over time. So
absolutely,
that's another key point.
Yeah,
it's like a moving average that wants to be consistent, not a week to week average.
Right.
Correct. Okay, Alex, he says, I was noodling along on my local XC mountain bike loop the other day when a question popped into my head that is equal parts useless and intriguing. He says, I thought about it for a bit, but figured, oh, well, I'll never know. It's been about a week and I can't get this question out of my head. Then it hit me. Where do I get my best useless or intriguing information from? The podcast, of course. Well, thanks. I think, Alex. Nate pointed to himself, by the way. If you're joining us on YouTube, you can see it. He says, so the question, do riders or mountain bike riders shift gears more or less than average Joes? I argued both sorry, say that again, Chad.
Pro riders. He's distinguishing.
Pro riders.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do pro riders shift gears more or less than average Joes? I argued both points to myself on my ride. Obviously, pros shift less because of the sheer power they possess. The gear they are in is less important. Nonsense, dummy. They shift more because they are smarter than us mortals and know exactly when to be in what gear to optimize their cadence. Need to work on your self-talk. You're not a dummy, Alex. And says, please discuss. I must know. Yours, signed from overthinking. Welcome to the club, Alex. I like it. Good question.
You're in
Chad,
good company here.
I didn't expect you to have a study on this one. I thought it was going to be purely anecdote. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I have very little, and then we can get to all the anecdote. But first off, if you're overthinking it, so are about 1,000 PhD candidate and grad students and researchers out there, because this is such commonly tread ground. There are so many studies dissecting pedal mechanics and optimal cadences, and there's a lot. But to distill it down, it's really just a trade-off between a few things. They want to optimize economy. And that takes place over longer efforts. And then they want to maximize power output, typically takes place over shorter efforts, and then just minimize the muscular and then the energetic tolls. All right. So single study back in 2000 with Sia and colleagues, and they examined preferred pedaling cadence in professional cycling. It's exactly what we're talking about. And what they noted is that pros use distinctly different cadences across high mountain climbing stages, flat individual time trials, and then flat long group stages. And my takeaway is simply that these are riders who are obligated by necessity, by actual day-to-day survival, to achieve a balance between the performance and the physiological toll, right? So if they, professional cyclists, consistently gravitate toward distinct cadences for different types of stages, you can bet they're shifting a lot over the course of each of those stages. And I firmly believe that this is one of those characteristics that in professionals actually applies and benefits amateur riders. It definitely carries across ability levels.
Mm-hmm.
Amber, have you noticed any, it is once again, Chad provided studies there. Now let's completely tread outside of the realm of studies and let's just go into anecdote. Have you noticed
this
anything
is the
like
science
this,
and
Amber?
stuff, right?
Yeah, this is the stuff part of science and stuff.
Yeah. Have you noticed this, Amber?
Yes, actually, I have, and I think I don't know if it would be accurate to say pros shift more or less than amateurs, but I will say that I think pros use their cadence as a tool that they can wield in different scenarios. So I think that most pros have developed the ability to ride well, efficiently, with good economy across a very wide range of cadences, probably more so than most or less experienced athletes. And this is, as Chad said, something that anyone can work on. You know, practice riding at very low cadences, and you can really work on your form and your brain body connection. Practice riding at high cadences, getting that speed and that quickness. All of those things will benefit you because the more comfortable you are across a range of cadences, the more that's available to you in any given scenario, right? It's just they're adding tools to your toolbox that you can grab when you need them. I would venture to guess that less experienced riders overthink this a lot more. And this is one of those things that comes with the cognitive efficiency of experience. So the longer you've been riding, the more you've honed this range of skills of cadences, the less you have to think about it. And I would say that most pros think very little about shifting. It's just something that becomes automatic to them. And there are situations where I don't think it's necessarily a conscious decision to shift to be at a cadence of 88 because that is optimal on this terrain. That's not really how it's going to work. It's going to be more about comfort, and pros are very in tune to their body, and they are going to say they're just going to get this minor sensation of like, this doesn't feel comfortable, I need another gear, that they're going to grab it. And that's all going to be very, very automatic. And it's not going to be an explicit thought or decision that they make. It's just going to be a part of the flow that they're experiencing in that moment. And you can get there. So it's just a matter of getting more comfortable across a range of cadences and then experiencing that and experimenting with that on the road. So I think it's less about like a conscious decision to optimize and more about the experience of learning what works for you. The other thing is, once in a while, you get in a situation where you are stuck in a gear that you don't want to be in, whether that's because you had a mechanical, your Di2 battery died, whatever it happens to be, and having the ability to manage those scenarios well with the least amount of interruption and stress is also another important skill to have if you're a professional. So as an amateur, this is definitely something I'd suggest working on, and you can trust that with experience, this will become easier and easier and more intuitive for you.
Nate, do you have anything to add to this one?
Oh, just like shift. It's pretty easy. It's kind of like people are like, is my breathing wrong while I'm cycling? Like, I think I should breathe this way, and like, just do it. It'll come second nature to Amber's point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to share just some things I've observed. So yesterday, actually, I have electronic shifting that counts how many times you shift. You can look at the app and it can tell you. And yesterday on a 1 mile loop, it was 4 minutes long for short track. I shifted an average of 41 times every lap. So that shows how much. Now that's going up and down. That's one big climb and one big descent. Not really any difference between that. So that's a lot of shifting. And I personally have noticed that pros shift a whole lot more. Like Amber said, they're prepared to be able to ride at a wide range of cadence, but they do not hesitate from hitting that shifter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
that
a
was
really
a study.
big thing. Oh, sorry, Chad. Go.
That was a study looking at pro road riders, mountain bike riders. You could probably 10x the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But there's a temptation to not do that. Also, I've noticed like a temptation when it's really steep and really difficult, that it's almost like you kind of give in to like that really hard grinding cadence. I have that temptation. And I've also seen other athletes do it too, when you could probably just shift down one gear and all it is a simple click. And it makes it a whole lot easier to just spin and probably stress yourself a bit less. Maybe you'll rock a bit less when you do that and save a little bit of energy. Maybe you'll reposition yourself a bit more comfortably on the saddle. There's when we come into mountain biking and everything else, there's traction to keep in mind and what you're doing to maintain that traction. And that's kind of a whole different ball of wax. But I have noticed that average Joes tend to, and Janes tend to shift less than pros. Now, another interesting point, we talked about the crest of the climbs. With pros, I noticed that over the top of the climb, they grab a ton of gears really quick because they really want to get going quickly. Todd Wells blew my mind with this one year when at Nationals, I was pre-riding and he went by me to the top of a climb. And I feel like he went from the smallest cog down to the biggest cog, just like the fastest shifting I had heard. He just dropped right down. And then that, because he was busy getting going while I was busy thinking about how hard that climb was. And that's something that I think is a common thing where they're shifting in anticipation. They're like, let's get going here. Like, and they're, once again, like Amber said, they're using it as a tool. So I'd encourage everybody to try, if you're riding on a loop in particular, try a lap where you don't think about shifting. And then the next lap, actively think about it and maybe shift a bit more and see if you're a bit more comfortable. Or maybe your speed goes up when your time on it. I don't know, but
let me know how much
helpful.
success you have with trying that lap where you're like, okay, on this lap, I'm not going to think about shifting.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. I kind of, I poisoned the well with that one, didn't I?
That's a tough one.
Yeah. Ryan says, hey guys, love the podcast. Y'all are amazing. So informative, easy to listen to, honest and open, which I really value. Thank you for that. Thanks for all the kind words, Ryan. Appreciate that. Thanks for listening. Says, I have a question about turbo trainers. Which for those that aren't in the UK, that's just a trainer. Trainer and turbo are synonymous. I started cycling in July 2021 and was 75 kilograms with an FTP of 190 watts at the time. Through staying consistent in my training, although trying a number of different platforms out, I've just reached 64 kilograms with an FTP of 255 watts and absolutely loving the sport with an eye on further progression. I bought a used wheel. Yeah, way to go. I bought a used wheel on trainer last September, Tax Genius Smart, and I've always been very happy with the trainer. It's functional, does the job well, and I've seen incredible progression utilizing it. I often hear people saying that having a direct drive will be a game changer. And direct drive trainer, what's a direct drive trainer? Nate, can you describe what that would be?
It's the cog is on the trainer, so you don't have a wheel, but it's your chain is on the trainer. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah.
John, you
take your wheel off.
That guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, there
wheel
you go.
off trainer.
Yeah, it's nice. You don't have to wear down your tire or worry about squeaking or
Slipping.
having. Yeah, it's handy. While I can see the value in a lot of the aspects of a direct drive trainer, I'm often skeptical that it will actually add any value to my training or the results of it. I'm of the thought process that I am the main contributor in this aspect and that I reap the rewards of what I consistently invest, regardless of the tools at my disposal. I'd like to hear what you all think and have to say about the importance of more modern equipment trainers and if it adds any value to training. Nate, can you take us on this one?
It is a nice to have, but it's like kind of like a nicer, like, sunglasses. There's like the $40 pair. There's like the $200 pair. You're like, that's kind of nice, but you don't need it to win the race at all. You'll be fine the whole time. So if you don't want to lay down that money, you could get just as fast with a wheel-on trainer. If you're slipping a bunch for accelerations, you can get a trainer tire. That's the only thing, or like put it down harder. But other than that, it's you're good. Like it's just a nice to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I use a pair of just basic rollers, and I think that my training is fantastic. Like. They have enough resistance so that I can hit my power targets. That's the key thing that you want. I feel like that's probably the biggest limiter in some trainers is that either the resistance floor is too high so that your recoveries are, you're recovering at too high of an intensity. It's kind of funny. Like a lot of trainers in their release, they're like a max of like 1800 watts. This one does 2600 watts. And I'm like, who cares? Like you're not doing max sprints probably on the trainer, right?
Let me explain that a little more. That was an issue for many years when we didn't have a lot of smart trainers. Someone would come in and they'd have an FTP of, 150 or something around that. And based on the minimum resistance of that trainer and their smallest gear, they might only be able to get down to 130. So in a rest period and interval, they were just like, almost at threshold the whole time. And it was, the people who probably, I'm going to generalize here, but oftentimes, when you build a product, you think of yourself and not everybody else. So probably the people building trainers, probably men who cycle a long time, right? And they think, oh yeah, 140, that's easy. Like we could do that. That's other people's FTPs.
Yeah.
Small, it's like it's very hard. So that was an issue. Now, luckily too, if that is one, maybe then like a smart direct drive trainer is a great idea, because those go pretty low in terms of how what the floor is. That's one reason to get one.
Yep, absolutely. The convenience part is handy if you, on the wheel off thing, setting up a bike on a trainer is just another step in between you and getting your workout done. And Nate's talked about this before, all the different steps that you can do to just make things easier with the trainer and with getting your workouts done. It really does add up. It's like compounding stress. Chad mentioned allostatic load earlier. You have so many things coming in that aren't coming in from your training, and they're affecting you. And then if you add like 6 steps prior to getting onto your bike and getting your workout done, sometimes it's just that last step that's a really small thing that's enough to push it over the edge, and you don't do that workout. So this is a thing where I see a lot of people say, so a wheel off trainer is just super easy. Well, it's only easy if you can keep your bike on it. And that's like, so I don't think like a wheel on or wheel off trainer necessarily makes it easier in that regard, because you'll still have to set it up. And then if you get your hand greasy and stuff with taking a wheel off, it might even be more of a pain. So I'm not sure it helps in that regard. And that's one that I've seen referenced pretty regularly online.
The side note, but interesting for a lot of people, because I didn't know I had ADHD before, and maybe it was apparent to everybody else. But the one issue is task starting. And so I've designed my life to make things that, like I said before, I can just jump on the bike. All the bottles are ready, everything, because it's that extra, it takes a little bit extra grit to start the task. Then when you're in it, you're fine. And then on some tasks, it's hard to finish. Like it's right there, it's 10 minutes away, and you don't want to do it. It's responds to dopamine stuff in your brain. And another one that can help if you do have ADHD is have a stimulant like caffeine. So if you're early morning workout, get everything set up, have some caffeine, jump on the bike, it's no problem. If it's later in the day, you're tired, nothing's set up, and there's all these little tasks you have to do in front of it, it's super easy to distract, to do something else, to not have that workout happen. So that's, I don't know. I think that just doesn't apply to just ADHD people. It's for everybody, but it can be more extreme if you have it.
Yeah. The other thing that I've noticed with just trainer hardware in general is that most trainers are getting very good these days. And in terms of it affecting your workout, I'm not sure that trainers really do that unless like across the board, they're getting really good. So in your case, Ryan, I wouldn't stress, especially if it puts some sort of financial burden on you. I wouldn't stress about it. You're getting great quality workouts. As long as you're not being affected by a resistance floor, like we talked about, then you're probably in a great spot. And it won't make you, probably won't make you any faster. So unless it makes you excited to get on your trainer, and then that helps your workouts and makes you feel really good, that's another thing to consider too. So, yeah. All right. Before we go, I have one last thing. Nate, I don't know if you posted it yet, but I saw something that you were going to post on your Instagram. You did. Okay. Yeah. Everyone should head over to Nate's Instagram. Good little meme that Nate built up, because it's been a totally normal week. No news in our space whatsoever. Totally normal. I think nothing going on whatsoever. So,
it's a story, so it's going to be gone.
Oh, it's a story. So people have to go there quick.
Yeah. TR
right.
Nate. TR
right.
Nate.
TR.Nate on
what
Instagram.
A tease. Like, it feels so dirty what we just did.
It's okay. Let me take it, Nate. You're clean. It's just stains on me. So everybody, if you're listening right now, thank you so much. You can submit your questions at trainerroad.com/podcast. And please do that this week. Even if they are a question like Alex said, where he said that he felt like it wasn't a very good question, but it was just a mental musing that he had going on, please send them in. We'd love to hear them. trainerroad.com/podcast. Share Trainer Road with your friends and the podcast with your friends, and rate the podcast on Spotify. Go over there and do that now. That would be a huge help for us. We'll talk to you all next week. Thanks, y'all. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.